I've lived in these mountains my whole life, and I'm telling you, there are things out there that can't be explained. Anonymous Appalachian resident. From Wendigos to the Mothman, Appalachia's folklore is filled with terrifying creatures. But what happens when folklore becomes reality? Brace yourself as we uncover 3 true horror stories that will make you think twice about venturing into Appalachia's wilderness after dark. Let's begin. I still remember the exact moment when my life turned into a living nightmare. It was 2020, and I was just 13 when I first heard that bone-chilling laugh echoing through our farmhouse in Adams, Tennessee. My father, John Bell, had been acting strange for weeks, constantly looking over his shoulder and whispering to my mother about something in the cornfields. That night, as I lay in my bed, trying to ignore the unusually cold air, I heard it, a voice that would haunt me for years to come. "Sweet Kate," it whispered, using my nickname. The voice wasn't coming from outside my window or down the hall. It was right next to my ear, so close I could feel its cold breath on my skin. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Nothing but empty space and that horrible, knowing laugh. The next morning, my little brother was covered in bruises he couldn't explain, and my mother found all our dishes smashed on the kitchen floor. Father gathered us in the living room, his face pale and drawn, and told us what he'd been keeping secret. For weeks, he'd been seeing a dark shape in the fields, following him home from his walks. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then the whispers started. Whispers that knew things about our family that no stranger could possibly know. I watched my father's hands trembling as he spoke, and that's when I realized whatever was happening to us wasn't just a series of strange coincidences. Something had chosen our family, and it wasn't going to leave us alone until it got what it wanted. The entity, which people would later call the Bell Witch, grew bolder with each passing day. It wasn't content with just whispering anymore. It wanted to be heard. In the middle of our family prayers, it would mock us with demonic verses. During dinner, invisible hands would snatch food from our plates and throw it against the walls. The voice began to change too, sometimes sounding like a sweet old woman, other times like a growling beast from the depths of hell. But what terrified me most was how it knew everything about us, our secrets, our fears, our private conversations. It would recite them back to us in that sing-song voice, laughing at our horror. My father took the worst of it. Night after night, I would hear him screaming in pain as invisible forces pulled his hair, slapped his face, and stuck pins in his skin. I would find him in the morning, exhausted and covered in welts, his eyes wild with fear. My mother tried to stay strong, but I could see her breaking. She would sit in her rocking chair, tears streaming down her face, as the witch tormented her with visions of our deaths. The entity seemed to take particular pleasure in describing, in vivid detail, how each of us would die. But what made it worse was that some of its predictions started coming true. Small things at first, like telling us when visitors would arrive, but then bigger, more terrifying prophecies. Word of our haunting spread through Adams like wildfire. At first, people thought we were crazy or looking for attention, but then they started coming to our farm, curious to witness the phenomenon themselves. The witch never disappointed. It would put on shows for our visitors, singing hymns in multiple voices at once, accurately telling strangers about their past and future, and even materializing objects out of thin air. Some nights, our yard would be full of cars and news vans as people came from miles around to hear the Bell Witch speak. But they didn't have to live with it. They didn't have to endure the endless psychological torture, the physical abuse, or the constant fear of what it might do next. Even a famous paranormal investigation team came to document the phenomenon. I'll never forget the look on their faces when all their expensive equipment malfunctioned simultaneously, while the witch's cackling laughter filled the air. In 20 years of investigating, their lead investigator declared, "I've never encountered anything like this." The entire team fled our property that night, and word of their experience only added to the legend. But for us, it wasn't a legend or an entertaining story. It was our daily nightmare. The witch had turned our home into a prison, and we were its captives, forced to endure its sadistic games while the world watched in fascination. The witch's true nature became clear when it revealed its ultimate goal: the death of my father. It would whisper to him every night, "John Bell, you're going to die. I'm going to kill you." We watched helplessly as my father's health began to deteriorate. The once strong man who could work the fields from dawn to dusk now struggled to get out of bed. His hands would shake uncontrollably, and his speech became slurred. The witch would mimic his weakened voice, laughing at his suffering. We tried everything: prayers, medicines, even consulting with Native American healers, but nothing could stop the entity's relentless assault. The torture reached its peak when the witch started targeting me specifically. It would appear in my dreams, showing me visions of my father's death, forcing me to watch him die in 100 different ways. During the day, it would follow me around the house, whispering that I was next, that our entire family was cursed, that we would never escape its grasp. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even pray without hearing its mocking voice. The worst part was knowing that everything it had predicted so far had come true. When it told me the exact date and time of my father's death, I felt my heart turn to ice, because deep down, I knew it wasn't just tormenting us anymore. It was fulfilling a prophecy. The 20th of December, 2023, a date that's burned into my memory forever. I woke up to my mother's screams and found my father in a catatonic state. Next to his bed was a mysterious vial of black liquid. The witch's voice filled the room, louder than ever before, gleefully announcing that it had poisoned John Bell. As we watched in horror, my father's breathing became more labored, his skin turning a sickly gray. The witch sang hymns of death, celebrating its victory while my father slipped away from us. When he finally took his last breath, the entity's laughter shook the walls of our home. It had won. It had fulfilled its promise. But the witch wasn't finished with its cruelty. During my father's funeral, it sang drinking songs and laughed at our grief. It appeared to everyone present, bragging about how it had killed John Bell and warning that its work wasn't done. The black vial was found to contain a mysterious poison that no one could identify. More chilling still was the witch's claim that it had forced my father to drink it while he was unconscious. The entire town attended the funeral, not just to mourn my father, but to witness the witch's final victory. As we lowered his coffin into the ground, the entity's voice rang out one last time. "I am satisfied now. John Bell is dead. He's in hell, and I am the cause of him being there." Years have passed since those dark days, but the Bell Witch has never truly left us. Though its violent manifestations eventually subsided, its presence lingers like a shadow over our family and the town of Adams. Sometimes, on quiet nights, visitors to the old Bell property still hear that familiar laugh echoing through the trees. Children whisper stories about the witch, and parents warn their kids to stay away from the cave where the entity is said to dwell. But they don't know the real horror. They didn't live through it as I did. They didn't watch their father die at the hands of an invisible tormentor, didn't endure years of psychological torture that left scars deeper than any physical wound. I'm an old woman now, and I've spent my life trying to understand why our family was chosen for this torment. Some say it was a curse. Others claim it was a supernatural force beyond human comprehension. But I know the truth. The Bell Witch was something more sinister than any ghost or demon from folklore. It was an intelligent, calculating entity that derived pleasure from human suffering. As I write these words, I can still feel its presence watching me, waiting. And sometimes in my darkest moments, I hear that familiar whisper, "Sweet Kate, I never really left." Perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all. The Bell Witch hasn't ended its reign of terror. It's just waiting for the right moment to begin again. I never should have gone into those caves. The archaeological dig was supposed to be routine, just another day documenting Native American artifacts in the Appalachian Mountains. But what I found there changed everything I thought I knew about history. It started when my flashlight beam caught something unusual on the cave wall. Not the typical Cherokee petroglyphs I was expecting, but something more sophisticated, more alien. As I traced the strange symbols with my fingers, the rock suddenly gave way, revealing a hidden chamber that shouldn't have existed. The air that rushed out was ancient, carrying with it a smell that made my skin crawl. But it wasn't the chamber itself that made my blood run cold. It was what I found inside. Scattered across the floor were hundreds of small handprints, pressed into the clay thousands of years ago. They were human, yet not quite human. The fingers too long, the palms too narrow. And the walls. The walls were covered in detailed astronomical charts that predated any known European contact. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound from deeper within the cave, like something dragging itself across stone. I told myself it was just echoes, just the wind. But then my flashlight caught something moving in the darkness, something that reflected the light back at me like a cat's eyes, except these eyes were human-sized and pale blue. The discovery haunted me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I spent weeks in the Cherokee archives, searching for answers. That's when I first learned about the moon-eyed people. The elders spoke of them in whispers, pale creatures that lived in the mountains long before the Cherokee arrived, beings that could only emerge at night because sunlight burned their sensitive eyes. The more I dug, the more disturbing the stories became. They weren't just legends. There were too many consistent details across different sources. The structures they supposedly built still existed, hidden beneath centuries of forest growth. Their writing system, which no one could decipher, appeared on rocks and cave walls across the entire region. But it was the physical descriptions that truly terrified me. Every account mentioned the same features: small stature, alabaster skin that seemed to glow in darkness, and those haunting blue eyes that were far too large for their faces. I found medical records from the 1800s describing unusual specimens found in the mountains, bodies with eye sockets twice the normal size, and bones that seemed to glow under certain types of light. The Cherokee told stories of driving these creatures from their fortifications, forcing them deeper into the mountains, but they never said they killed them all. They never claimed victory. Instead, the stories always ended the same way: warnings about venturing into certain caves at night, about the sounds of movement in the darkness, about eyes watching from the shadows. It was during my third expedition to the cave system that everything went wrong. I'd brought better equipment this time: high-powered lights, recording devices, and a state-of-the-art camera to document everything. I was determined to prove these creatures had really existed. As I set up my base camp in the main chamber, I noticed something odd about my recordings. Every time I played back the audio, I could hear something in the background, a language that didn't sound human, spoken in whispers so quiet I initially mistook them for static. But when I ran the audio through filters, the whispers became clearer. They were discussing me. In a language that shouldn't exist, they were talking about the intruder in their home. That's when my lights started failing, one by one. Not all at once, but in sequence, like something was systematically darkening the cave around me. In the dim glow of my last working light, I saw them. They emerged from cracks I'd thought too small for anything to pass through. Their movements were fluid, almost graceful, but wrong in a way I can't describe. Their skin was so pale it seemed to absorb the darkness around them, and those eyes, those massive glowing blue eyes, stared at me with an intelligence that was decidedly inhuman. They didn't attack. They didn't need to. They simply surrounded me, watching, waiting, as if they knew exactly what would happen next. What they showed me that night changed my understanding of everything. Through a series of images projected directly into my mind, they revealed their true history. They weren't primitive cave dwellers. They were refugees. Their civilization had existed long before humans walked the earth, hidden in vast underground cities that stretched beneath entire continents. The structures attributed to them by the Cherokee were merely outposts, observation points from which they monitored humanity's development. But it was their connection to the moon that truly terrified me. They showed me visions of their world, a place beyond our comprehension, where the laws of physics bent and reality itself seemed fluid. They weren't named for the moon because they could only see by its light. They were named for their origin. The moon had once been their home, before some ancient cataclysm forced them to seek shelter on Earth. The caves weren't their dwelling place. They were their embassy. And now, after millennia of watching and waiting, they had decided it was time to make contact. But as they shared these revelations, I began to understand the horrible truth. They hadn't chosen me by accident. They had been watching me since I first entered their domain, testing me, evaluating my worthiness. And now that they had revealed themselves, there was no going back. I had become part of their grand plan, a plan that had been in motion since before recorded history. The changes started slowly at first, so subtle I could almost convince myself I was imagining them. My skin became more sensitive to sunlight, forcing me to conduct my research at night. My eyes began to adapt, growing more sensitive to light, while somehow seeming larger in the mirror. I found myself understanding symbols that had previously been meaningless, reading their ancient language as easily as English. But it wasn't just physical changes. My dreams became filled with memories that weren't my own. Memories of vast underground cities lit by bioluminescent fungi, of technologies beyond human comprehension, of a civilization that had watched humanity's entire history unfold from the shadows. The moon-eyed people hadn't just shown me their secrets. They were gradually transforming me into one of them. Each night, I felt a stronger pull toward the caves, an overwhelming urge to return to what they were starting to feel like, home. I began to understand their purpose, their patient waiting game that had lasted millennia. They hadn't been driven away by the Cherokee. They had simply retreated, biding their time, waiting for the right moment to begin the next phase of their plan. And now, as I feel the last vestiges of my humanity slipping away, I realize I'm not their first convert. I'm just the latest in a long line of transformations. This recording might be my last communication as a human being. My transformation is nearly complete, and soon I'll join my new family in the depths of the earth. But I need to leave this warning for anyone who might follow in my footsteps. The moon-eyed people aren't a legend, and they aren't extinct. They're more numerous than you can imagine, living in vast networks of caves that honeycomb the Appalachian Mountains. They're watching, always watching, selecting those who might be worthy to join their ranks. If you're hiking in the mountains and feel eyes upon you, if you hear whispers in a language that sounds almost familiar, if you find yourself drawn to caves you know you should avoid, run. Run while you still can, because once they choose you, once they reveal themselves, there's no turning back. They're patient, so patient. They've waited thousands of years for the right moment, and now something is changing. The transformation happening to me isn't an isolated incident, it's the beginning. They're preparing for something big. And as I sit here, my newly enlarged eyes adjusting to the darkness, I can finally see their plan unfolding, but I can't tell you what it is. They won't let me. All I can say is this: the next time you're in the mountains at night, and you see a pair of large, pale blue eyes watching you from the shadows, know that you're not looking at an animal. You're looking at humanity's future, and they're looking right back at you. I still wake up screaming some nights, drenched in cold sweat, remembering those glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness. But I need to tell you what really happened that night in Flatwoods, the night that changed everything. The 12th of September, 2015, started like any other evening in our quiet West Virginia town. I was walking home from the local diner when a blinding light streaked across the sky, moving in ways no aircraft should. The light was so intense it cast shadows in broad daylight, and then silence, dead silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. That's when I heard the screams coming from the Morrisons' farm. I should have run away. God, I should have run. But instead, I grabbed my phone and started recording, heading toward the commotion. Other locals were already gathering, their faces pale with fear. Something had crashed in the woods behind the farm, leaving a trail of strange, metallic debris that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly glow. The air felt charged, like right before a lightning storm, and there was this smell, like burning copper and rotting eggs. We formed a search party, thinking we might find a downed plane. How naive we were, how utterly unprepared for what awaited us in those woods. None of us could have imagined that in just a few minutes, our understanding of reality would be shattered forever. Looking back now, I realize that moment was our last chance to turn back, to remain blissfully ignorant of what lurks in the darkness beyond our world. But curiosity got the better of us, and we pressed on, our flashlight beams cutting through the thickening fog that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The fog grew denser with each step we took into the woods, swirling around our feet like ghostly tendrils reaching up from the earth itself. Our flashlights barely penetrated the murk, creating eerie halos in the mist. The Morrison boys led the way, with me and 4 others following close behind. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since we entered the tree line, and our breath came out in visible puffs. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. The usual chorus of cricket songs and owl calls had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. We found the first piece of evidence about a quarter-mile in, a perfectly circular patch of scorched earth, about 30 feet in diameter. The grass wasn't just burned, it was crystallized, like it had been frozen and burned simultaneously. The trees surrounding the circle were bent outward, as if something had landed with tremendous force and then, what? Moved? Disappeared? That's when we noticed the tracks. Not like any animal tracks I'd ever seen, and I've been hunting these woods my whole life. They were circular impressions, about 2 feet across, arranged in a triangular pattern. Whatever made them was big, real big, and they led deeper into the woods, toward the old Thompson place that had been abandoned since the 80s. We followed the tracks, our phones recording everything. Though the footage later turned out distorted and unwatchable, the air grew thick with that metallic smell, making it hard to breathe. My head started pounding, and I noticed blood trickling from Billy Morrison's nose. Something was very wrong here, but we were too far in to turn back now. None of us were prepared for what happened next. As we approached the old Thompson house, our flashlights started flickering, and the batteries in our phones drained in minutes. The fog had become so thick we could barely see each other, but through it, we noticed something that defied explanation. The air itself seemed to bend and twist, like looking through warped glass, and in the center of this distortion stood something that shouldn't exist. At first, we thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but then it moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 12 feet high. Its head was shaped like a spade from a deck of cards, but metallic and smooth, reflecting our dying flashlight beams with an oily sheen. But the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They glowed like hot coals, pulsing with an internal light that seemed to bore straight into your soul. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My whole body felt paralyzed, caught in the creature's gaze. Time seemed to stop, and in that moment, I felt something alien touch my mind. Images flooded my consciousness. Stars I'd never seen, worlds that couldn't exist, and a sense of purpose so vast and incomprehensible it threatened to shatter my sanity. Billy collapsed next to me, blood now streaming from his ears. The others started running, but I couldn't move, trapped in some sort of psychic connection with this thing that was definitely not from Earth. What happened next still haunts my dreams. The entity took a step toward us, moving with an unnatural fluidity, like mercury flowing through air. Its body seemed to shift and change, as if it couldn't quite maintain a solid form in our atmosphere. The air crackled with static electricity, and my hair stood on end. I could taste metal on my tongue, and my teeth ached like I'd bitten into ice. The being raised what might have been an arm, though it looked more like a shifting mass of metallic shadows. A high-pitched whine filled the air, growing in intensity until I thought my head would explode. Through the pain, I realized it was trying to communicate. The images in my mind became more intense. Flashes of stars dying, worlds burning, and something massive moving through the void between galaxies. I understood then that what we were seeing wasn't the true form of the entity, but rather something our minds could comprehend without breaking. The real truth was far more terrifying. The creature's presence seemed to distort reality itself, causing the trees around us to blur and shift like a bad photograph. The ground beneath our feet vibrated with a deep subsonic hum that made me nauseous. I watched in horror as small objects, leaves, twigs, even rocks, began to float upward, defying gravity. Survival instinct finally kicked in, breaking through the paralysis that held me. I grabbed Billy's arm and started running, dragging him with me. Behind us, the whining sound reached a fever pitch, and the air itself seemed to tear apart with a thunderous crack. The forest lit up like daylight, and waves of energy pulsed through the trees. knocking us off our feet. I could feel the entity's presence in my mind, growing stronger, more insistent. It wasn't trying to hurt us, it was trying to show us something, to warn us. But human minds weren't meant to contain such knowledge. Billy was unconscious now, and I had to carry him. The others were long gone. Every few steps, I'd look back, seeing those glowing eyes through the trees, getting closer, always closer. The fog was everywhere, disorienting me, but I kept running. My lungs burned, and my nose was bleeding freely now. The electronics in my pockets were hot enough to burn. Through the trees, I could see the lights of town, seemingly miles away. The entity's presence in my mind grew overwhelming, images of destruction, invasion, and something worse. Something coming. I stumbled and fell repeatedly, but the fear of what was behind me kept me going. The sound of helicopters cut through the night, military aircraft heading toward the woods. Whatever was chasing us paused, its attention drawn to the new threat. That was 8 years ago. The official story says we encountered a weather balloon, or maybe it was swamp gas, or mass hysteria. The Air Force investigated as part of Project Blue Book, but their findings were inconclusive. They confiscated our phones, our clothes, everything we had with us that night. They took samples from the scorched circle, but I know they found something because they quarantined that entire section of woods for months. Billy Morrison never fully recovered. He's in a psychiatric facility now, drawing the same symbol over and over, a spade-shaped head with glowing eyes. The others who were there that night, they've all moved away, changed their names, trying to forget. But I can't forget. The images it showed me still surface in my dreams, warnings of something massive heading toward Earth, something that makes that entity look like a scout, an advance guard. I see it clearer every night, a vast shadow moving between the stars heading our way. The entity wasn't trying to harm us, it was trying to prepare us. Sometimes, on clear nights, I look up at the stars and wonder if anyone would believe the real truth. That what we encountered in Flatwoods wasn't just a visitor from another world. It was a refugee, running from something far worse. And whatever it's running from, it's getting closer.